We'll go ahead and get started. Um, does everybody have a paper? We've got a couple left if you need one. So I ran across these articles a couple months ago and started reading them and found them very, very interesting. So I'm going to try and convey this information to you guys the best I can. But I've always really enjoyed history, anything to do with history. And a couple of years ago, Preacher Brian did a class on who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Does anybody remember that class? Nobody remembers that? And I guess I'm not going to ask the next question as to who the Pharaoh was. No, you're fine. So what he had settled on, the Pharaoh that he had settled on was Amenhotep II. And in piecing this together and reading what these archaeologists have got, I agree wholeheartedly. But I want to start out this evening a little bit of a review of how they got to that conclusion. And that's where your timeline is going to come in. Now remember, and this always messes me up, on a calendar, if you look at a timeline, I'm used to going left to right. From 0, birth, AD, BC, AD. Farther away you get from there. On this one, we're in BC for everything. So the farther to the left of that timeline, the later the date. So, and that can get a little bit confusing. There's a whole lot of names in here. A whole lot of them sound kind of alike. The only difference between the pharaoh's names and some of them is whether they got a 1, 2, 3, or a 4 after them. So it gets a little bit confusing, and that's why I kind of wanted to hand that out. It's a little bit small, but if you see what I printed that from, it was, and I had to blow it up, and trying to do that on a computer with me, it doesn't work very well. So the other thing I wanted to say is this is all a little bit muddy. You are trying to take our calendar and work that into an Egyptian timeline. People that did not keep records by dates. They kept by pharaohs and hieroglyphs. So it can get a little bit muddy in that way. So just be a little bit loose on dates. If we're off by a decade, that's not that big of a deal. We're going to be talking about 3,500 years ago and when these people were born and when they lived. I can't fill out any piece of paper that I don't have to put my birthday on, and I guarantee you 3,500 years from now, ain't nobody going to know when my birthday was. So they're doing the best they can. They know pretty close, but like I said, it can get, but there are also pretty good timelines from the Bible. The Bible is such an excellent, excellent book of history. And I think that is, well, I know it is. That's a big problem with archaeology, is they don't want to use that. They'll say, oh, that's not history. But time and time again, it proves history to be true. And there's several examples of that we're going to cover tonight. But I also want to say what I'm going to be talking about tonight is not a hill I'm willing to die on. I'm not going to stand here and tell you this is the Pharaoh and this is the date. Can't do that. But I think with the things that I'm going to show you tonight, you'd have a hard time fitting anybody else into this. And what we're going to be covering is the possibility for Moses and evidence of who Moses was in Egypt. And we'll talk about it later, and you tell me what you think. If you think they're close or if they're way off. But so, like I was saying, our calendar, the Gregorian calendar, was developed in 1582 or something like that. So it's a little bit tough. So let's see, where was I here? Why didn't the Egyptians record the events of the Exodus? Any thoughts on that? Yeah, I mean that's what I think. Nobody talks about the fight they lost. You want to talk about the ones you won. It's embarrassment. But in 2003, there was an inscription that was discovered in a tomb that revealed that Egypt was almost completely wiped out by Cush, which is Ethiopia. And one small inscription, and nobody had any clue of that before they found that inscription. And the reason is because Egypt historians tried to cover it up. They didn't record it, or if it was recorded, they would erase that. If they recorded something about the battle, they would try and wipe that out of history. They didn't want their defeats to be recorded. Egyptologists have noted that Cush, had they stayed in Egypt, that basically the entire Egyptian history would have been eliminated. They beat Egypt up bad. And that's how close they came to extinction. The incredible thing is that the Jewish historian Josephus wrote about that. He's a first century historian. We've mentioned him here several times. He wrote about it in the first century, but due to a lack of archaeological evidence, they pretty much airbrushed it out and just said that didn't happen, that Josephus is full of it and doesn't know what he's talking about. And if a near extinction event like that could be airbrushed from their history, isn't it possible or even likely that the events surrounding Israel's Exodus would be erased? So, in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, the Pharaoh is only mentioned as Pharaoh. It does not give the first name or his official name. It wasn't until the 10th century BC, and from there forward, that the pharaohs began to be named in the Bible. First Kings, I think, is the first time that a pharaoh's official name is mentioned. At that time, instead of using their official name, they just referred to him by title only. A majority of the scholars agree that the Bible's Exodus account falls within Egypt's New Kingdom period. Now, the New Kingdom period is a period about 500 years long, from about 1570 to 1070 BC. That's a pretty big gap, so we're going to try and narrow it down a little bit. Historians divide the New Kingdom into three periods. It's the 18th, the 19th, and the 20th dynasties. And that's just which family ruled in that time period. The first was the Tutmosis dynasty, which was named after the ruling family. They ruled from about 1570 BC until around 1300 BC. But when it comes to biblical chronology, the Bible points to the Exodus occurring in the 15th century. 1 Kings 6:1 connects the Exodus to the building of Solomon's temple. And it says, "Now it came to pass in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over the land, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." Now that makes calculating the date of the Exodus just arithmetic. And then if you use the accepted date for the building of the temple as 967 BC, that puts the Exodus in 1446 BC. And then Israel's entrance into Canaan 40 years later in 1406. So remember what I said, 1446 is when they left Egypt. You add 40 years to that, which is the time they wandered in the wilderness, you come to 1406. Numbers are getting smaller when you get closer to AD. 1 Kings 6:1 is not the only scripture that we can use to calculate this. Judges 11:26 states that the time of the judge Japheth, which is around 1100 BC, the Israelites had dwelt in the land of Canaan for about 300 years, which puts their arrival around 1400 BC. So see, you got 1406, 1400, there's just 6 years difference there. Chronicles 6 lists 19 generations from the Exodus to the building of the temple. This fits into the same time frame of a 15th century Exodus. And with these events happening nearly 3,500 years ago, we need to remain a little bit flexible on our dates. If we concentrate on the general time period, the New Kingdom and the Tutmosis dynasty, we'll take a look at specific pharaohs. So this is where your timeline is going to come in handy here a little bit. Now, like I said, it's a little bit small. As a matter of fact, it's a lot small for my tired eyes. Wow. So, Akhenaten is the first pharaoh that we're going to look at. And he falls in this between 1400 and 1350. You'll see his name in there. He's in the mid 14th century time period. And from him, we're going to work our way backwards to the left. During Akhenaten's reign, it's recorded that there was a great upheaval in Canaan by a people known by the Egyptians as the Habiru, which is very close to Hebrew. The Habiru conquest started during the reign of Amenhotep III, which is Akhenaten's father. Next guy to the left. And that If we're working with our 1406, 1446 as the Exodus, that falls into Amenhotep III, into his life. Amenhotep III led Egypt for approximately 40 years from the late 15th century, and Amenhotep III was only known to participate in one military campaign, and he was known more as a pacifist. I did have, and I forgot about this, these pictures. The first guy we talked about, Akhenaten, he was up here in the top left corner. And I had to shrink that picture down a little bit that guy really had a horse face on him. His face, everything, it was just real long and stretched out. And I thought, man, if that's what that guy looked like, he was not a good looking fella. So one interesting inscription that was found from the timeline of Amenhotep III. So Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III, says this was an inscription found. It was about a nomadic group of people known as the Shasu, or the nomads of Yahweh. Amenhotep's father was Thutmose IV. Thutmose IV only reigned for 9 years. He was not supposed to be a pharaoh. And this is known because of an inscription that was placed between the paws of the Great Sphinx in Giza. That stone was placed there in the very first year of his reign. And on that, he claimed that he was divinely installed to the throne because he was not the firstborn and not the original intended heir to the throne. So what happened to the firstborn whom Thutmose took his place? Could it have been a result of the 10th plague? There's no known inscriptions stating this, but we know that the firstborn of Pharaoh was not spared. Exodus 12:29 says, "Now it came about midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn cattle." Some suggested that Thutmose IV murdered his way to the throne, but there is absolutely no evidence of that in any of the Egyptian writings. The fact that the Pharaoh of the Exodus survived the 10th plague logically implies that he too was not a firstborn. And interestingly enough, the father of Thutmose IV was Amenhotep II, and he was also not the firstborn. But he was the heir to the throne. Now, here's something interesting. This large picture here, on the bottom of the front page, that's Amenhotep II. That's his mummy. And if you will look at his neck. You see those bumps? What was the 6th plague? Yeah, boils. Yeah. It's amazing to me, 3,500 years ago, and you can still see stuff like that. So, with the Israelites entering Canaan in the late 15th century, we can use the lifeline of Moses to develop a timeline. The Bible states that Moses died at the age of 120, with his life divided into 3 40-year periods. First, for 40 years, he was a prince in Egypt. The second 40 years of his life, he was in hiding in Midian. And at the age of 80, he was called to deliver Israel out of Egypt. And then he wandered for 40 years in the desert with them. And that's Exodus 7:7 and Deuteronomy 29:4. Now, if Israel entered Canaan near the end of the 15th century, 1406 period, and you add 120 years, Moses' life, to that, this places the birth of Moses very close to the early part of the reign of Thutmose I. Having said all that and run through all those confusing dates, just to get to what I actually want to talk about. And that is, if you look on the last page of that handout, could this be Moses? The royal family of Thutmose I is interesting. Thutmose I had a fully royal daughter. Her name was Hatshepsut, born to his fully royal wife, Ahmose, and he also had a half-royal son. His half-royal son was Thutmose II, and he was born to they called her a minor wife, whatever that is. Her name was Muntofret, something like that. So in order to secure his son's place on the throne in Egypt, Thutmose I had his 18-year-old son marry his 24-year-old half-sister. So Thutmose II and Hatshepsut married each other, half-brother and sister. And if the timeline is correct, and if Thutmose I is the pharaoh at the time of Moses' birth, that means his one and only daughter, Hatshepsut, is the pharaoh's daughter from Exodus 2:5, where it says, "The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile, and she saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her maid, and she brought it to her." Hatshepsut would have been between the ages of 10 and 15 years old at this time, which you all know, if a 10 or 15-year-old girl sees a baby, they're right there on them. So Thutmose II, his reign with his half-sister Hatshepsut, it didn't last very long. He was very sickly, and they did not produce a male heir through Hatshepsut. Instead, she bore him a daughter, Neferuru. That's the best I can say it. He did have a male heir, which is Thutmose III, but that was through a concubine. So Thutmose III was only 2 years old when his father died. And as such, Hatshepsut reigned as co-pharaoh with her stepson. So he's 2 years old, he's a pharaoh, she's running Egypt. Probably up until he got well into his teens. and they reigned together for 22 years. No, she didn't get married till she was 24. But if the timeline's working out, she was between 10 and 15 years old if she's the one that found the baby Moses in the Nile. And then at the age of 24, she ended up getting married to her half-brother. So her and Tutmos III reigned for 22 years, but by all accounts, she was a very good and very kind Pharaoh. There are inscriptions saying that she had a heart full of love, and another says her spirit is inclined towards foreign people. These attributes fit well with the biblical description of Pharaoh's daughter, who would have raised a foreign child from poverty and bring him to royalty. And coincidentally, during the reign of Hatshepsut, a commoner, somebody not of royal blood, was catapulted in rank to the highest levels of the Egyptian administration and royalty. In fact, Egypt historians clearly state that he was not. It was a man was not of royalty, but of common origins, and his name was Senenmut. He rose quickly in Egyptian society and yet mysteriously disappears from history around the mid-1480s. So if you do the math, and he would have been a baby at around 1526, 40 years later is 1486. And that at that time, he just disappears. And during Senenmut's time in Egypt, he was granted nearly 90 titles by Hatshepsut. Hereditary crown prince of Egypt, count, sole companion, master of all people, chief of the whole land, chief royal architect, chief steward, who conducted all the works of the king, confidant of the king, chief steward of Prince Neferuri, Hatshepsut's daughter, wearer of the royal seal, overseer of the granary, overseer of the storehouse, and then the list went on and on for the things that they knew that he was over. First question that most people would ask is, if this is the biblical Moses, why isn't he called Moses? Josephus states the name Moses was strictly an Israelite name. It would have been a very common thing for him to have an Egyptian name and an Israelite name. Another interesting fact is the name Senenmut. Senenmut means mother's brother. And in essence, it was a title elevating a son to equal status with his mother. And if you think about the age that she was when she found him and took care of him, and to name him mother's brother, it'd have to be, it's another coincidence, I guess. But the changing of names was common, especially when they went to foreign countries. Daniel, Belshazzar, Hananiah to Shadrach, Mishael to Meshach, Azariah to Abednego, Hadassah to Esther, and there's a lot of others. But the name Moses is strictly Hebrew in origin. And In this case, the name Senenmut makes sense, with a young Hatshepsut recognizing herself as both an adoptive mother and sibling. Another interesting tie to this possibility of a different name is found in Hebrews 11:24 and 25. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Senenmut appears to have risen through the ranks in military service. He participated in military campaigns in Ethiopia, which is called Cush. While there's nothing in the Bible about Moses' exploits in Ethiopia, other than Numbers 12:1, says Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. Jewish historian Josephus again wrote an entire chapter about Moses' military exploits in Ethiopia. One of the greatest signs of how close Senenmut and Hatshepsut were is the number of statues of him holding her daughter. He was her tutor. There are several statues that depict the young girl sitting on his lap. And one of the things you have to understand in that society, non-royals were not allowed to be even in the close presence of royalty, much less the daughter of the Pharaoh. And one of Senenmut's greatest achievements as royal architect was overseeing the building of Hatshepsut's burial complex. On the second page of the pictures, the top left, that's a statue of Hatshepsut. On the bottom, that is her burial complex. And Senenmut was the chief over the building of that. If you look that up, you may recognize it here, you may not. But if you see a daytime aerial picture of that, I just about guarantee you most of you have seen this. It is huge. And these were not things that they built. They didn't build this after they died. They spent their entire reign having their burial spots. They were being built while they were reigning. So there was a lot of time spent on this. And this is one of the best known burial sites in Egypt. Senenmut was also involved in the construction of his own burial chamber. And on that page in the top right is his burial chamber. And it's located very close to Hatshepsut's. But here's the thing. Nobody was ever buried in that tomb. In fact, it was the tomb that says is marked for Senenmut. It was under construction, and in the middle of the construction, they went in and destroyed it. The sarcophagus, they smashed it into pieces. It wasn't completely done, but they completely destroyed it. They did the best they could to erase his name off of anything in there. They sealed it up, and they did it in such a hurry that there were still workmen's tools sealed inside that chamber. The disappearance of Senenmut is not the end of the story. After his departure, many of his monuments and inscriptions were vandalized. His tomb was severely damaged in what appears to be an attempt to completely erase him from history. His sarcophagus had been shattered into pieces, and one Egyptologist described it as Senenmut had been the victim of someone's relentless hate. Hatshepsut's tomb suffered pretty much the same fate. They did their best to erase her from history also. The attempted destruction was not complete, though. Several statues and inscriptions survived, one of which has the strange inscription, "The steward Senenmut, it is who comes forth from the flood, and to whom has been given the inundation, that he may control it, even the Nile." So it says he came forth from the flood, and he can control even the Nile, basically is what it says. New information points that Amenhotep was the one who ordered that they be erased from history. In any case, if you don't remember, Amenhotep is who was named as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So, if there's evidence that shows that Amenhotep is the one that ordered these tombs to be destroyed, he had a great hate for them. And if this was at the time of the Exodus, you think about 1 million slaves walking out of your country. Everything that you were building, everything you were doing depended on those slaves. You'd be a little bit angry. The fact that if she was the one, if this was Moses and she's the one that rescued him from the Nile, and that was the beginning of all this, he would have a great hate for her and a great hate for him. And they would do everything they could to wipe their name out. Like I said, though, it's either all coincidence or it's a possibility. I myself, I find it really interesting that you can find timelines that fit very close to Moses coming onto the scene, or this Senenmut coming onto the scene. 40 years later, he just disappears. 40 years after that, the Exodus happens. 40 years after that, there's writings about the things that are going on in Canaan and how there's people being driven out of their homes in the land of Canaan. It's a lot of coincidence for that not to be the timeline. Whether or not Senenmut is Moses, we'll never know. But I just thought it was interesting when I was reading it, and I thought it would be a decent Wednesday night lesson, and you're going to get out early. I hope you enjoy that. But I hope you enjoyed and this lesson, and just if it doesn't do anything else, if it makes you a little more aware, it has me. It's made me a little more aware and a little more detail-oriented when I'm reading. Because that's kind of the way I operate, is I like timelines. I like to know when things happen in an order. If it does something like that for you, then I think that's a good thing. But like I said at the beginning, this is not something that I'll ever stand up there and say, by golly, that's who that was. But that's it. So